Hello, everyone. I think that we are finally live here, 7:01. Welcome. Welcome on behalf of Valley Outreach Synagogue, or a congregation, or a me, USC Kasdan Institute, Hebrew Union College, and the Jewish Center for Justice. I'm Jennifer Nye. I'm Jewish chaplain and associate spiritual leader at Valley Outreach Synagogue. And we're talking this evening about how to dismantle the effects of systemic racism. So I want to frame the evening briefly with a story from Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who founded and popularized the psycho-spiritual and ethical practice of Musar in 1800s Lithuania. It very closely resembles mindfulness. And by the way, he also developed the concept of the conscious and the subconscious processes, and how important it was for a person to be aware of subconscious motivations and to work on understanding them. So here's a little thing that Rabbi Salanter said. He said, when I was a young man, I wanted to change the world. I found it difficult to change the world, so I tried to change my nation. And when I found I couldn't change the nation, I began to focus on my town. I couldn't change the town. And as an older man, I tried to change my family. And I think we can imagine how that probably worked out. Now, as an old man, I realized the only thing I can change is myself. And suddenly I realized that if long ago I had changed myself, I could have made an impact on my family. My family and I could have made an impact on our town. And their impact could have changed the nation, and I could have indeed changed the world. So it's exactly with this awareness of Musar that until I do the work on myself, there'll be no change within my family, my community, my nation, and my world, that VOS's Anti-Racism Task Force chose this topic and this particular panel. Both Frank Baird and Dr. Max Klau are experts in how to do that work on oneself, and how each of us act on and are acted upon the many systems that are part of life in the United States. Now, when Kiyomi Kowalski recommended Frank and Max, I raised the concern that a panel of three white people here talking would be just perceived as white-splaining. So we agreed that it was so important that I explain our thinking from the outset. And basically, Black people, all people of color, have been carrying a very heavy load of educating white people for a very, very long time now. And so we feel that it's time for white people to step up as anti-racists and to do the work of educating other white people. And the communities of Valley Outreach Synagogue, of Congregation or Me, are overwhelmingly white. So we're not here this evening to speak of the experience of people of color in America. We're here to look at how white people can work to dismantle the effects of systemic racism in ourselves and in the systems within the United States. So, frankly, a clearer title, what I should have said was white people working to dismantle the effects of systemic racism. So, and all in an hour and a half, absolutely. So we're going to be taking questions throughout the next hour and a half through the anonymous Q&A feature. Well, it depends on your device, whether it's at the bottom or along the side, but look for that Q&A. So please make use of it. We'll try to get to as many as possible, which are relevant to the evening's discussion. And I also want to note that this evening, we're addressing racism, not anti-Semitism. And in fact, another interesting discussion would be about whether in 2020 America, white Jews constitute a race who experiences racism, but that's just for another evening. Hopefully we'll come to that in 5781. But for this evening, I'm just so honored, just absolutely excited that we're going to get to learn from Frank and Max, who not only brilliant and careful thinkers, but just such good souls. So Frank, licensed marriage and family therapist, licensed professional clinical counselor, is a mindfulness-based, collaborative, solution-oriented psychotherapist, life coach, and mindfulness trainer. Among many accomplishments, founder and lead teacher at Now House Mindful Awareness Center, founder and clinical director of Now House Therapy Center, and Frank brings a unique expertise in mindfulness from the perspective of whiteness. And his website, frankbaird.com, is there's wonderful little things for you to find there. So I encourage you to visit. And then welcome and thank you. And Dr. Max Klau serves as the Chief Program Officer at the New Politics Leadership Academy in Boston, which is a nonprofit, and that's dedicated to recruiting and developing military veterans, how he met Kiyomi Kowalski in the first place. So developing military veterans and alumni of national service programs to seek political office. And Max's book, Race and Social Change, A Quest, a Study, a Call to Action, was published in 2017. And in your book, which of course is why I'm so grateful for to have you tonight, you note the connection between individual choices and the emergence of more global patterns from a whole system perspective. And then we can see how the personal plays into and is key to dismantling systemic effects. And all of the research and the data and the empiricism that you based your work in just was very compelling to show how systemic forces have such a powerful and dramatic effect in way of warping human and individual behavior. So, and I also, despite how, the real intellectual rigor, you brought just such vulnerability as well with modeling from your own personal experience. And that's where I really want us to start off this evening, because doing this personal work is difficult. Not only, of course, because spotting our part in things is so difficult, but I think admitting it is even harder. It can feel just so uncomfortable, even threatening. And more than 35 years ago, VOS grew out of a 12-step recovery program. So our community's minhag, our custom, is very much about self-inventory, but it doesn't mean it's easy. And of course, we know that it never ends. So I was hoping, Max, that you would start us off with describing some of your personal journey towards awareness of race.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. So I grew up in a Jewish family in the suburbs of Hartford, Connecticut. We were part of the conservative movement at that point, and a lot of talk about social justice. But it was a very white middle class suburb where we had conversations about people that we just pretty much never ran into, and that was kind of my, where I started out, was having lots of conversations. I always kind of knew race was very important in this country, and it was incredibly controversial. I knew it was kind of essential to our history. And I never really understood it. All I knew was that things would happen and everybody disagreed about what was going on. And I just really lived with the question of how does this work? Because I really didn't understand it for a long time. And pretty much for the first quarter of my life, my conversations about it with people with my similar background, with my skin color and my socioeconomic status. And in hindsight, I realized we were kind of in a bubble and did not understand the full system. And I can say that a really important moment for me was I had the chance to be a group leader for a program called Operation Understanding DC, which was based in Washington, DC. It brought 30 teenagers together. 15 of them were Black and 15 of them were Jewish. And we did a month-long summer civil rights tour. So we went to places like Birmingham and Selma and Montgomery and Philadelphia, Mississippi, and really toured all these, kind of important places. And for the first time, I was engaging with American history with people who didn't look like me. And just again and again, I felt like the scales were falling from my eyes. And connecting with people of color and really getting a sense of their authentic experience, I just again and again kept saying, I had no idea. I just had no idea that that was your experience, that was what was happening to you. And it led me ultimately to the ed school at Harvard, where I ended up spending getting a doctorate years, just trying to understand how do all these pieces fit together, my own personal experience, but how is that part of a larger narrative, and how do these systems work? And so it was really a journey of awakening to a system in which I and we have always been immersed, but we do not see because we are at the top of the system. So much of it is invisible to us. And so that has been my journey of trying to get some perspective on that system and how I am placed within it and how I might shift it a little bit and how all of us might do that. And I'll pause there.
Thank you. And Max, would you also please describe your own experience of working on your personal awareness?
Constantly uncomfortable for year, just I was uncomfortable and afraid for just years and years, and made lots of mistakes. And I felt shame and guilt along the way. The more I understood about how these systems kind of privileged me in ways that I didn't ask for and didn't understand, but definitely helped me a lot in ways other people didn't have those privileges. And I said things that I learned were really mistaken. But there was something about the willingness to stay in it and to listen and to recognize we're all in this together. So we have to understand each other, kept me in it. And ultimately, it led to the book and just finally a way of kind of understanding how all these pieces fit together in a way that I thought made sense.
Thank you. Thank you. And Frank, tell us about your own personal experience.
I remember I grew up at Edwards Air Force Base, and even though it's possible in the military to have a color-rich environment, my experience was mostly white. And I remember the first time I experienced a narrative other than the typical traditional white narrative of history was when I went to college. Imagine that. College is such a place where you get into trouble. And I remember hearing that Native Americans had a different experience than the one that was told in the cowboy and Indian movies. And then I moved to San Francisco, which is a really diverse place. And I had like these experiences of diversity, but I also think what I've come to think of as like the white reaction to it, which is I was going like, well, why are they so angry? And, and a lot of familiar sort of judgment, uninformed judgment, that my perspective was uninformed. And that when I made the effort, it was still heavily biased. And then I forget how many years ago, the thing that made the biggest difference was I was part of a spiritual community where the lead teacher was a woman of color, a Black woman. And for some reason, she was interested in our community being more inclusive and more diverse. And so she started a People of Color and Allies meeting. Because I'm one of those people who volunteers for everything, I said, would you like a white affinity group? Like, do you need somebody who can talk with white people about the white experience and why it's important for us to take up these ideas and take this effort? And she said yes. And I went home and was very mad at myself because this was the most terrifying thing I'd ever done. And so I started doing a White Allies group. And really, I think of it as like twofold for me. One is I would have done anything for this teacher. Like, I really loved her. She was very, very wise. And so taking on this journey felt like not just an anti-racist journey. It felt like a journey into discovering more about me, discovering more about the world. I mean, it really is. When I started to be a therapist, the first work that I did was at a sexual assault recovery center. And I remember the experience then being like, wow, I had no idea women had these kinds of experiences in the world. It was like a whole different view of the world had become apparent to me. And when I started doing this, it was a similar thing. And I'm going, I'm a pretty smart guy. I'm pretty interested in things. I read a lot. I talk to a lot of people. I'm a therapist, so I really get to, get close with people. And part of me was going, how come I didn't know this? And so part of my journey was, I want to know why I don't know. I want to know how it is I could be, however old I was then, I'm older now, how I could be that old and not know this. And really, I think, and not feel it, right? That it was sort of an intellectual thing. It's like, I get that other people experience the world differently than me, but not feeling it, and really not becoming aware of the systems that are responsible for our conditioning. And so that was the start of a journey that I think of as a personal growth journey, for one thing. I want to know me better. I want to know my biases, my preferences, prejudices, and as a therapist, part of my training is, how can I meet whoever comes to see me, and how can I be helpful to them and not have my own biases, my own preferences be take the lead. Like, what kind of help do they want, and how can I help them get the help they want their way? And I took that on in terms of understanding race and racism better. And I have to say, it's ongoing terror. But I also think, I found a way to be comfortable with uncertainty, which I don't know if you've noticed, but life is full of uncertainty. So it seems like a really good skill to develop. But it's just, it's such I think of it as, it can be hard and frightening and arduous work. And it's also, I think, the most rewarding, and in terms of my own spiritual growth, I think it's contributed the most significantly to my growth as a person and in my spirituality.
Thank you, because I think about it sounds, what I hear you describing is like a certain wholeness, right? Even though there's pain, and as you say, discomfort and difficult things, but to work and to come through that, then to be, and as you say, Max, because these aren't things that are going away, and we're all in this world together. So, you mentioned, I thought that was very interesting, Frank, you mentioned about, a white affinity group. And so what I'm curious about is, it sounds like you're saying that people of color don't need to be present to that work in order for the work to not be racist or to be done right, that this is something that, white people can work together towards.
Yeah, there was, I don't know if it was a recent article. This is one of those things where it's new to me, but I don't know how new it is to the world. But there's a fabulous writer on whiteness named Tim Weiss. And he put together, I wish I had the citation here readily available, but it's sort of ethics for white folks taking up anti-racist activities. And one of the things he said was, we're not doing it for people of color. We're doing it for ourselves because it's wrong. Racism is wrong. It's not the kind of people we want to be. It's not the kind of system that we want to be a part of. And so in that sense, white people need to do some work with other white people. I also think it's really important. I mean, eventually, right, we're accountable to one another. So we can't do it exclusively alone, but white people go through a process, and people of color, one, don't need to be burdened by explaining to us why we need to do some work, why we would benefit from doing some work. They don't need to be burdened by that. Plus, so often when they try to tell us, we won't listen to them, right? It becomes like, you don't know me, you can't tell me what to do. That's where we get into arguments around words like privilege and what is a racist, and these sort of conceptual problems. But white people have to go through a process. It's hard to find out that our history is what it was. And so I think it takes a lot of kindness and compassion. As a therapist, it's like, you can't ask somebody into a place of self-discovery if it's going to be filled with judgment, because then they're going to be busy hiding from the judge. So one of the benefits of white people getting together and talking about this is then things like, you hear this term derisively, like white tears and white guilt. Those are real things. And we need to have a place where we can work through that and get past our own judgment about it, about whether we should or shouldn't have white tears, in order to be able to grow and then be ready to partner up with people of color and, and make a collaborative effort where we're as skilled as our partners.
Thank you. That it leads me to actually want to quote one thing. It's a bit of a long quote from your book, Max, by author and educator Debbie Irving, but I think it's so helpful because it speaks to this dream, this cultural fantasy that so many white people are enmeshed in, and exactly as you just described, Frank, what it is to suddenly become aware of it. She says, learning about how racism works didn't challenge me just because it was new information. It was completely contradictory information. A 180-degree paradigm reversal, flying in the face of everything I'd been taught as a child and had believed up to this moment. America's use of racial categories seemed fraught with unfairness, cruelty, and dishonesty. Yet my parents, grandparents, and entire extended family's life philosophy had revolved around fairness, compassion, and honor. This was my legacy, the one I took the most pride in passing on to my children. Discovering I'd been complicit in perpetuating a system that was so very terribly bad flew in the face of all I'd understood about myself. And so that shock of thinking, but wait, I'm a good person. You know, how can I unknowingly be benefiting from and even perpetuating racism? Max, do you think that most people go through this shock of, most white people have this this shock of realization?
Yes. For anybody who's interested, that book is a book called Waking Up White by a woman named Debbie Irving. It's great for anybody who wants another resource around this. But certainly my personal experience was very similar to hers, of just like shock. There was definitely like awakening to just guilt and shame of there was this system. I had no idea it existed. And a lot of just trying to figure out, I aspire to be a good person, to be a moral person, but I'm part of this system that's far bigger than me, that privileges me, and while limiting opportunities for others, and just how to be with that. And it really is like awakening from a dream. Just everything I thought, it's just a ton of unlearning of things I thought were true are not really true. So then what actually is true, and it's very disconcerting. And I do think, I just don't know how you do this without walking through some dark emotions. Now, and I talk a lot in the book, like, if you haven't felt guilt about America's system of race, you probably haven't really understood how it works. That being said, if you get stuck there, if you start operating from a ground of guilt, that's just not productive. So it's something we have to move through. And a lot of the inner work around this is how do we work with the dark emotions that come from the wholeness of trying to be with the wholeness of this, which has a lot of strength and beautiful, noble values, and also just a tremendous amount of pain and trauma, and try some way to hold that and show up from a place of service and not a darker place.
It's so, Frank, when you describe about how helpful it is to become comfortable with the uncertainty, or to just know that that's part of things, and to be comfortable with the discomfort, maybe, how do you suggest that people cope with that?
I think one of the things that helps me is the difference is being able to tell the difference between the individual and systemic problem, right? So usually what happens is people of color are talking about systemic racism, and white people take it personally. So they, as if it's my fault. I think you said earlier, right, this, but I'm a good person. This doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It means I've been, I really like the phrase, under the influence of racism, right? So, and I do that like with, under the influence of patriarchy, under the influence of sexism, right? So it says that I've been influenced by it, but it's not my fault, it's my conditioning. And so that helps, right, with the uncertainty, because it gives me a little bit of a cushion that says, it's not my fault, so much for the guilt. Not really so much for the guilt, but let's a little bit of the guilt. It helps it be a little more tolerable. And really, I think of it as it's not my fault that it exists. And now that I'm more aware, there are things I can do, but I don't know yet what that is. Right. So if you think of it like recycling, I don't know how many people, sort of feel like I want to save the earth. Right. But I don't know, is recycling enough? Is this enough? Is this enough? That kind of worry, I think, is really useful. That's a part of the process. But as Max was saying, right, if you get stuck there, that's a problem. And again, that's why I think it's really helpful for white people to be talking with white people, because one of the things we can do is, some of us are, I don't know if you'd say this as a road, but some of us are further down the road and can help you with get out of that place where you're stuck. So part of it is recognizing this isn't my fault. This is my conditioning. And even then, right? So I have this biased view that people are good. And well-intentioned. I also feel like a lot of people could do a lot better, but that we're doing the best we can. And that what happens is when systems start to emerge, they take on a life of their own. And there are these unintended consequences, right? So some racism is very deliberate and very specific. And some of it is the unintended consequences of just like benefiting. Like slavery was really important to the economy in the South, and who doesn't want to benefit from the economy, right? So it's kind of like, then you unknowingly take up a value or a belief that is based in racism, but you weren't aware, so it's not your fault. So then finding out, being willing to find out, I think of it as like deconstructing my values. One of the things I think about, there's two different ways of relating to faith. One is you just blind faith. And the other, which is my preference, which is challenge it, deconstruct it, right? That then it's a much more living faith. It's a stronger faith. So I think of that with like these beliefs. Instead of saying, you don't know me, that's just sort of a catchphrase, but you don't know me. Instead, it's like, it turns out you kind of do. Right? I'm a white guy. I'm going to do things white guys do. I had this terror. I've gotten better at it, but I still have it, that I'm going to go speak someplace and somebody's going to go, that is so white of you. And at the same time I go, and it is. Or that's so male of you. And it's like, yeah, it is. Right? So part of it is this beautiful getting to self-acceptance. It's not my fault. There is something I can do about it. And I'm not a bad person. That I feel bad is the evidence that I'm a good person. So can I go on that?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you all. I'm so sorry. This is like a weird voice from other. So this conversation is beautiful. Yes. Yeah, it would be less creepy, I guess, if I turned on my video. We are having some technical difficulties. So the situation is this. Jennifer, you're on in the Q&A chat box. We have a few good questions here.
Yes. I was going to go to that. Yep.
Yep. Thank you. Sorry, y'all.
So one of the questions exactly towards what you're saying, and I'll ask it of you, Max, is questioner asking, could you please give us an example of something that you believed to be true, but discovered was not?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, and I talk about it in the book, I remember being a teenager in Simsbury, Connecticut, and just really trying to figure out, does race matter? And I was really trying to search my life for a moment when it limited me or caused me problems, and I just couldn't find it. I was like, this isn't a thing, which is, when I look back at that, I can't believe that. But then I got to sit down with people of color who told me all the stories about, I would walk into stores and not notice anything. They would walk into stores, they would get followed, I would drive down the street and nothing would happen. They would drive down the street and get pulled over by the police. And just again and again, I realized I was just kind of breezing through these systems that I just didn't see them because they didn't limit me the way they limited those people. And that kind of opened up this whole worldview, you know? So that's one thing. And, you know, I'll give one other example. You know, W.E.B. Du Bois talks about double consciousness and how people of color have this they have two voices in their head, which is like, there's what I'm going to say in front of white people, and then there's what I really think is going on. And they just live with this two-ness, right? There's kind of the way you have to show up around people with power, and then and it suddenly dawned on me that not having that was internalized privilege. Just thinking this is the way things are, there's one way to do things, this is it. And to suddenly realize that was my way of going through the world, but not shared by other people, was another kind of aha for me. And I feel like, you know, through this years of work, there was just again and again, like I have unlearned another thing. But those are two examples that really stand out for me.
I remember my own shock when I learned about the Tuskegee experiment, that doctors would deliberately, without a person knowing, a Black person knowing, inject them with syphilis in order to understand better the effects of this disease. And I was so stunned, and I was pretty, I'm going to say, I mean, high school, just shocked that that could happen in America, and by a doctor. You know, such trust in the Hippocratic Oath. And so exactly that sense of what else do I not know? What else is going on? There's some more before we're so close to moving into systemic. So there's a few things that I just want to ask, some of the questions that are coming along. And in particular, there's some that are very, you know, relational. So for instance, one person asks, how do I respond to racial remarks or respond to people who make racial remarks while talking to me, or who say they aren't racist, but their behavior indicates that there's things that they're doing they may not be aware of that are racist?
Well, I'll just say, there are good days and bad days. So, and I always hope for a good day, which means I think both a more kind and compassionate response, but also more effective, you know, being firm. Because, or I guess another thing would be my inside voice or my outside voice. You know, my inside voice is, are you, but the thing I like a lot is the question, is that racist? Because what it does is it's not confrontational, right? It's sort of like, it puts the, you know, I don't know, I know, but you know, I don't know, is that racist? And depending on how the person responds, it's either a chance for conversation, or if there wasn't a conversation, I didn't have to say, you know, that's racist, right? Right, they'll be quiet, or they'll be, you know, whatever. But I really like that. If there's a comment, is that racist?
Or even the what did you just say? Because I think it's so helpful when people can hear their own voice again in their head. Sometimes they go, oh wait, that joke you're not buying into. For instance, another one is, what do you say to Jewish people who can't seem to get past their own suffering? And so every time, you know, they tend to bring up anti-Semitism in the same breath as Black Lives Matter. So Matt?
You know, doing this work, trying to understand the systemic nature of this, you really get to this place of just so many groups are walking around with just deep trauma and kind of responding to the world. And there's get this place of, can we just hold each other with some compassion around how deep the pain is for all these different groups, you know? But there also does have to be some skillfulness around being able to hear people beyond your own trauma, you know, and, you know, in my book, I talk a little bit about, I was reading about John Gottman, who does marriage research. And he talked about successful relationships, they have good love maps. And a good love map means you know your partner's kind of things they're most proud of and their traumas. And you know that about them. And a few years later, I was reading a book about ethnic conflict by a researcher who studied ethnic conflict. And he was talking about these ethnic conflicts seem to be triggered when one group kind of dismissed or disrespected the other group's traumas or glories. And so you got this kind of the same relational pattern happening interpersonally in marriage and at the level of ethnic conflict. And this is kind of the deep work of, can we hear each other and understand the trauma different groups and the people who identify with those groups experience without just getting lost in it. And that is some deep spiritual work. And I really agree with Frank, who talked about how spiritual this experiences of trying to connect across these lines. But to understand we're walking through a world of just deep pain with so many groups who have had so much pain. But the question is, can we heal it, begin to heal it, and not just reinforce it and repeat it, so that our grandchildren are still suffering the same kind of pain? Is there a way we can turn towards it and work with it with some wisdom and skill and courage?
Yeah, amen. I think oftentimes, the Jewish tradition, when they're a mourner, you don't say something to a mourner. You know that there aren't words. You're just present. You're silent. And you're present to them. And so I think about, and I wish that more Jewish folks would take that approach towards people of color, recognizing here's a fellow mourner in terms of that kind of trauma. I think, like you, Frank, I think very much of, people are well-intentioned, they're good. And so I hope that that kind of question, that kind of remark about bringing up anti-Semitism is from a place of empathy, a place of wanting to build a bridge that says, yes, my people have suffered too, exactly that sense of shared trauma. But unfortunately, I think it so often does devolve into, well, who suffered more, and comparison, when it's exactly as you described. I mean, we're all hurting here. And I guess that I would say to the questioner, that if a person keeps wanting to speak about anti-Semitism, would just be to say, as you describe, we're all in different places of trauma, and to note, that the kind of systemic racism that people of color experience is so much deeper embedded in terms of what happens on a daily basis than, thank God, what a white American Jew goes through in America in 2020, even with terrible rise in hate crimes. So the question comes up here. Here's one saying, white people are asking, why aren't Black people and leaders doing or saying things which call upon their own people to take responsibility for what ails their communities? So I was hoping maybe, Frank, you might comment on that.
Well, I think the main thing is we just don't know, or we're just not paying attention. So when you think about, if you read books, because I think people still do that. If you read books, when was the last time you read a book by a Black author, or an author who was a person of color? Do you read any newspapers that are, or watch any, watch BET, the Black Entertainment Network? what do you really know about the conversations that are going on in communities of color? Because mostly what we know is what we call the mainstream media, which is now a tainted word, I guess, so I'll do it in air quotes. Mainstream media, right? What we know is what comes to us. And what comes to us is like filtered and filtered and filtered. So one is they are, and I would suggest, how could they not be, right? They're talking about their lives. They're talking about how to be alive, how to stay alive, how to live in this world, and specifically in this country. So, you know, I can't imagine them not talking about it, but I can imagine me not knowing that they're talking about it, me not knowing you know, the conversations that are going on. And then every once in a while, we'll see something, right? It becomes quote unquote newsworthy. And I would just sort of use this language. This language can be kind of provocative, but I would say, you know, the mainstream media is predominantly white, because that's what America is, predominantly white. And well, that's changing, but the systems are still predominantly to benefit, or not to, but benefit whites. So really they are, we just don't know it. And then it can be really fascinating to go find out what they are talking about, what they are doing, in terms of like personal accountability, personal responsibility, individual, family, and their communities.
I just have to jump in and agree completely. You know, once I kind of got out of my bubble, it was just amazing to see how much is going on in every neighborhood. There's a pastor, or there's youth workers, there's nonprofit folks. There is so much going on, and it is really a testament to living in a kind of a bubble, to not understand it. But there is so much effort going on in communities of color to support communities of color.
And having teens, I understand that social media, even those algorithms, for instance, privilege white YouTubers, white artists. And so, you know, they have to work very hard to look for, to search out, and to uncover. And then once they start subscribing to the media and the content of people of color, then the algorithm starts to recommend and find other things. But exactly that, you know, in my day it was Tavis Smiley, but, you know, having to go out, as you say, and do that hunting, because it's just not going to be on the news.
I can't resist. There's one more story I have to tell. I had kind of a remarkable opportunity. I met Steve Harvey's daughter. Steve Harvey, the host of Family Feud, you know, he's a big celebrity. Through a kind of crazy turn of events, it turns out Steve Harvey every year spends almost $1 million creating an event on his ranch for about 200 young men of color without fathers, to surround them with amazing Black men, many from the military, youth workers, educators, and he creates a parallel experience for their moms, and just this unbelievable kind of wraparound community to support these boys who don't have dads. I'd never heard about it. I don't think you have to really dig to find out it's going on, but I had a chance to just kind of be surrounded by this national community of Black men doing everything they could to support this community of Black boys. And I promise you, there is so much going on. It's incredible.
Thank you for that, because exactly, those are the anecdotes, yeah, that are the examples that really help. A question here. I resent being labeled as a racist or supporter of racism without any regard what motivates me politically, just because I identify as Republican. Do you think Republicans are racist?
You know,
who's going to answer that question?
I'll get started. I think it's important to note that when we're talking about systemic racism, this is something way bigger than politics and way bigger than our political parties. The deepest piece of work here, I think, is awakening from this idea that we are just individuals making our own choices, unconstrained by any systems. And we're all kind of on our own. That's just not the way the world is. We are deeply embedded in networks of relationships that are parts of a bigger system that we did not create. We were born into a particular moment of its development, but it really, in really powerful ways, privileges some people and oppresses other people. And awakening to that is just a bigger thing than politics. And understanding what it means to respond to the world with an understanding of that embeddedness. So I'll say that.
Well, and I think it's always really valuable to explore the assumptions behind questions, right? That often we just get right to the, like I think like as an example, so I don't know that this is true for the person who asked the question, but as an example, right? The idea of, I don't remember exactly how the question was asked, but why aren't people of color, doing things in their own community, right? There are assumptions there. Often we mistake our assumptions for facts, or we mistake our beliefs for facts. So one of the things that's really valuable in general, I think, of course, remember, I'm a therapist, so be suspicious of everything I say. But one of the benefits is going, yeah, what's behind the question? Because one of the things I've discovered, what Max was saying earlier about, I think it really is traumatic finding out the world is not the world I thought it was. Because when I start looking at what's behind the questions, I go, oh yeah, there are these assumptions and beliefs I didn't even know were embedded in that. So the idea, for example, that Black people are lazy, right? So maybe I'm the kind of person who would never say that out loud or believe it even. And yet a lot of the attitudes that we have, if we really examine them, we can notice that, oh yeah, that's behind that whole thing. That's behind all of those questions. So I definitely think, right now in America, it's really popular, the us and them in a lot of different ways. But the thing I was sort of chuckling about in the question is, I forget the last part of the question, but it was asking about, do you think Republicans are racist? Which in some ways is the least interesting or important part of it, because somebody's going to say yes and somebody's going to say no. But the part that is really valuable for me would be related to if they said yes, or if they said no, why? What is the evidence that supports yes, I'm leaning more in the direction of racism, or no, I'm leaning more in the direction of either not being racist or being anti-racist. Some people have suggested that, so I'm going to get in a lot of trouble here, so these are broad categorizations, but that liberals who believe they're not racist, but have been influenced by racist ideas are a lot more dangerous, because at least if somebody is overtly racist, we can go, look, there's somebody who's overtly racist, and either they're making a choice about it, right? They're doing it on purpose, or if they get called on it, maybe they'll change their perspective. But if you don't know, there's a really great book, I wish I could remember the name, it's called Racism Without Racists. And it's a great compendium of the different ideas we have where we think we're not racist, but it really is steeped in, you can call it racism, or you can call it anti-Blackness, or you can call it anti-anything other than whiteness or white supremacy.
Building on that, this whole framing of, am I personally a racist or not a racist, is inherently problematic in the sense of, this is not about our personal intentions and our personal beliefs. This is a system that is far bigger than any one of us, that has been around for decades, centuries, really. And you can have different personal beliefs and still be privileged by the system or oppressed by the system. And just this framing that we fall into of all of this is just about my personal kind of inner life is it's a problematic way to just frame the whole thing. That kind of makes it very difficult to understand the systemic truth of all of this.
And let's carry that then into focusing some more on system, out of the, right? I mean, because the personalization, right? You know, it's all about me, which, you know, on the one hand, it kind of is, right? Because I'm the actor in my own, and I have to know. And on the other hand, well, not at all. One questioner says, well, first of all, when we speak of a system, even before we go into systemic racism, but when we speak of just of a system, what does that mean, Max?
You know, a system is a bunch of parts that are interdependent and interconnected. And frankly, too complex to control, you know, living systems in particular. And you know, my work is grounded in the study of complex adaptive systems, which is, and they, all of them and across, you know, economics to chemistry to, you know, sales of shoes and stuff, all these systems, they kind of have some similar properties. And there is this emerging, you know, science of this. And I think it's really relevant to understanding matters of race and social change. I mean, that's what my book is about. But also, you know, there was a kind of a seminal book by Peter Senge called The Fifth Discipline in the business world of just thinking about how systems work and parts are interconnected. And if we can't see the whole system, we don't understand how our little piece of it is kind of reacting to a small piece of a bigger whole that we don't understand. So there is this, you know, just in the last probably 30 years, this real consciousness of we need to understand that we are small parts of something much bigger than ourselves. And that bigger entity has its own properties that are really counterintuitive. Like I spent years studying this stuff and was like, that's weird. That is, you know, some paradoxical, weird stuff. But we're immersed in that. And if we can't, the more we understand about how those larger, you know, systems work, the more we can work for the betterment of the system. Because often just taking care of ourselves actually might be taking actions that are actually not for the health of the system as a whole. So
it's helpful to hear you say about it being so contradictory and you know, paradoxical and things like that, because of course that's where I think the data is so helpful, because then you're like, well, but that's what it's showing us, this pattern, and just helping those things emerge that otherwise just surprise us. One questioner said, I looked at the definition of systemic racism on the internet and came up with a composite definition encompassing all the variations. So the questioner is wanting to know if you agree with this definition. Systemic racism is racism resulting from the inherent biases and prejudices of the policies and practices of social and political organizations, groups, or institutions. Each major part of US society, the economy, politics, education, religion, the family, reflects the fundamental reality of systemic racism.
Yeah, you know, the only thing missing for me, which a lot of white folks don't like, is it doesn't mention, you know, there's this idea that about reverse racism, and the way I use the term and understand the term would include, like, I really like that definition, except that it doesn't specifically call out the white-bodied supremacy aspect of all those systems. That those systems are set up to benefit people with white skin and white bodies. And in that kind of description, right, there's no such thing as reverse racism, because racism is based on the power differential, and especially in America. So this happens a lot when I'm talking with people in America. They go, well, what about, you know, people in Africa and, you know, two African nations where these black folk don't like these black folk. And it's like, yeah, you're talking about bias and prejudice there, and culture, but in America, it's important that we not leave out that the systems benefit white folk, and then my view is, and that really white folk need to be the ones to dismantle it. We've got the power.
I get worried a little bit about getting too far in our heads with this topic, and so if, to make it as concrete as I can, and I spent years trying to understand this stuff, like what is going on. And then I stumbled on this youth leadership program, and briefly it's what's at the heart of the book, but it was this week-long program for high school students that was about diversity and talking about racism and sexism and anti-Semitism and all the isms in a really kind of, engaging way. And on the very last day, the kids woke up for breakfast, as they always had, and they gathered in a circle, as they always had. And then something really weird happened. They were told to separate into groups: whites, Asians, Jews, Latinos, LGBTQ, blacks. And they were given armbands, and they were told, don't make eye contact with other groups and don't talk to other groups. And then they were sent into breakfast, and the white kids went in first, and they got a big table to sit at, and they got unlimited servings. And then every table lower in the hierarchy, every group lower in the hierarchy, went in later and got less resources, to the point where the black kids were sitting on the floor and they had almost nothing to eat. And they called this the separation exercise. And what it was an attempt to simulate a segregated, hierarchical, Jim Crow style social system, where the white people had a lot of the resources, and every group lower in the hierarchy had kind of less. And the Latino kids had to clean the tables, and the black kids had to sweep the floors, and they had to do the work while the white kids went and played Frisbee. And here was a system, a social system, an unjust, kind of racially hierarchical social system that you could just watch happen. And between breakfast and lunch, what happened was a mini civil rights movement. This is why I chose to focus, years of my life studying this, because you could kind of watch this system undergo a process of transformation in ways that were weirdly similar to real life. But that is what a system looks like, where people are separated, divided by the color of their skin, and granted different levels of resources and opportunities. And we are part of that. And, one part of, there was this whole kind of social movement happening, this whole uprising, and I realized I hadn't seen the white men anywhere. And I asked the director where they were, and he took me to this room in the basement somewhere. It was an air-conditioned, carpeted room where all the white men were watching a movie. And there was this huge social movement happening outside that they just had no idea was happening, And the metaphor is for people to sit in that room and talk about, am I a racist, are you a racist? And to not have a consciousness that there was this whole system of other things going on. That is the leap from, racism is kind of my own personal attitudes and actions, to I'm part of this bigger system, and we have to work to shift the whole system and see that consciousness. So I hope that makes it really concrete for people.
Yeah, thank you. Were you going to add something, Frank?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, and one of the nice things about that, when we, so often, either white people don't know, or they're afraid. And one of the things that I have really enjoyed is, really connecting with people in a really powerful and heartfelt way around when they see this, right? The difference between feeling powerless because it's a system and it's beyond me. And I think of it starts like this, right? Just people getting together and commiserating, right? We don't have power, but we can, at least we see each other with our lack of power. And then you start to see, oh, I do have some, I'll say at least influence. I have some power, I have some influence. And then I can start doing things, and it can start radiating out from me and around the world, and noticing I'm not doing it alone. I'm not singularly, individually responsible, but I'm also not singularly responsible for the solution. But when you start connecting with people, I think, especially around this, right, we really get to articulate some values that, don't get articulated when you're just going to the grocery store or something, right? How often do we get to experience our values every day in a really vivid manner. And so connecting with other people around being this way and making these kinds of changes is just so rich and satisfying.
And I want to use an example because I think I'm anticipating, or at least something that I often hear about is what you touched on, Frank, which is, but I'm just this one person, and that feeling of powerlessness with something that's so big. So just Sunday in the New York Times, there's an article published titled "Racism That Lingers at Medical Schools." So just looking at the healthcare medical system. And Dr. Damon Tweedy wrote, a 2016 study at one institution found that half of the medical students and residents surveyed agreed with one or more false statements about biological differences based on race, such as the idea that Black people had thicker skin and less sensitive nerve endings than their white counterparts. Such false beliefs left unchallenged, or worse, tacitly reinforced by professors, can lead a new generation of doctors to perpetuate discriminatory practices. To name just one example, Black patients are prescribed less pain medication for injuries comparable with those of their non-Black counterparts. So, Max, I think about the CEO of a hospital reading this article, right? I mean, CEO. This is somebody with power. So couldn't the CEO, root out those kinds of practices, or, the Surgeon General, right? Across the entire healthcare system, they both have power.
This is one of the most challenging things about understanding systems that, I spent years kind of working with this field of complex systems. And I have to say again and again and again, one is confronted with the reality that nobody is in charge of those systems. They self-organize. Yet we are kind of born into families and we live our lives in institutions with authority figures who really seem to be in charge. And it is very, very hard. I know it was very hard for me to let go of this idea that there was somebody somewhere making things happen the way they are happening. And really, we are all immersed in these systems. And when we make our individual choices, those choices coalesce into some emergent properties that are not being controlled by somebody somewhere. And there's nobody who can just, make a statement and change it, even the president, so there's a difference between having real influence and authority in a system and being able to control the system, and it's important to be mindful of that. And each of us in the choices we make contribute to the way that system self-organizes. So it's a way of thinking that, again, is a real challenge for the way we usually think about our own kind of autonomy and our impact on people. And so we have to wake up to a consciousness of how do my individual choices contribute to the larger patterns. And if those larger patterns are not in line with the values that I hope to bring to the world, how do I have to start making different choices?
And I think, as you're describing, Frank, the richness and the pleasure of the connection with other people, but also just what happens when you get enough of, I'm thinking of myself as like a little organism with a little flagellum or something, you get enough of us working within the system, and then that influence, am I correct? It seems that you're suggesting that actually does affect and shift and change the system.
Yeah, I think for me, it often, there's in the face of powerlessness, sometimes people will they'll take a stand, even though they're expecting it won't make a difference, because they need to experience themselves taking that stand. And one of the things that I really hate and appreciate social media, because I've certainly participated in my fair share of flame wars, but one of the things that I've enjoyed is that even if there's an interaction with somebody that isn't making a difference, there are people observing that. There are people who are either watching, bystanders, And really the word bystander doesn't do enough justice to how we participate in watching these things. And so if I take a stand and I don't expect this person, say this individual person, to change their perspective, but I got to do it for me. So I get to be connected more with my values and beliefs and being the kind of person, showing up as the kind of person I want to, but then also other people seeing it, right? And then that starts to have an effect. It's like I can still feel powerless and not recognize, not be aware at all the influence I'm having on somebody who watched me just do this thing that, you know, maybe I'm going, what was I doing? That was really foolish, or that was pointless, or, you know, what point did I think I was going to make? And somebody else is going, wow, that was really courageous. I want to do that too.
You talked a little bit about how these systems are just so paradoxical. And on the one hand, you're forced to confront just how like infinitesimally small each of us is in the midst of this. And at the same time, it's a truth that any individual action could potentially create this massive effect, you know? And in each of these exercises observed, it was one kid who just like challenged an authority figure. I'm not going to follow the rules. That was clearly something that tipped a whole system, you know? And you can see a fruit seller in Tunisia, like the Arab Spring, like individuals can have this massive action, and we're like comically finite in the midst of this whole thing. And part of it is holding those two truths.
And I think of the impatience, right? You know, it's like, so I took a stand, right? But did that end racism? Well, no. However, right, it was one more opportunity of, say, a stand for justice than an opportunity or an enactment of, so that I think it's really valuable, that belief, you know, both the belief that I don't control the system, I can't control the system, and nobody does, and also I have influence, at least in my immediate sphere, and so can I do what I can do?
Yeah, there's a story in Judaism, and I'm going to mess it up, and Jennifer, you correct me if I'm, but you know, the idea that both the universe was created for us and we're dust and we return to dust. And, you know, if you're getting too far on the word dust and I'm nothing, you should remember that the universe was created for us. And if you're starting to get arrogant, and then you should remember and we have to hold these two opposites. And that piece of wisdom really resonated the deeper I got into understanding these things.
Well done. You got it. Very interesting question, because a person asking, saying basically that using the word dismantle, they see that as a radical verb, as it sounds like even a violent verb, and says that, you know, that doesn't contribute to peaceful and better choices, to civil choices. It creates class struggle. That's the recipe for a Marxist agenda, which is also a system. And so, you know, would you like to respond? I mean, is it possible within, you know, our American system of current, you know, capitalism? Is this something possible to work to root out racism, or is this a revolutionary kind of apocalyptic thing that we're talking about?
I'd be disinclined to say apocalyptic. I might say revolutionary, right? Like if you want it to end, you know, apparently we're not going to do it neatly and politely, because we've had hundreds of years of opportunity to do that. I think one of the things, though, is that one of the things that happens in trying to talk about it is we get triggered by the language, right? So like a lot of Marxist language, somebody gets labeled social justice warrior, and then like we can discredit everything they say, right? Which really means we just stop listening. So one of the things I try to do is use language that fits for the audience. So I love all that social justice language. I think it says some things in ways that are really valuable to me to be said in that way. But I'm also aware that it's sort of like you could be speaking French to somebody who only speaks English, and they're going like, why won't you speak my language? Or worse, right? Because then there's an accusation about the perspective. You don't see me because you're, you know, one of them. So I like to use language that resonates with people. This is part of what I do as a therapist, right? Let me use your words that work for you, not words that work for me. And when I do a lot of this work, I don't even use the word racist, because mostly using that word with the people that you're hoping to reach doesn't reach them, it triggers them. Right? Because then you have to get into this argument about, are you calling me a racist, or, you know, or are you calling me names? So I think there's value in that language, and there are limitations in the language. And we really need, because I do think the language sort of evokes a kind of energy that doesn't resonate with, I don't know if I'll say most, I'm going to make a broad generalization here, but, you know, settled Americans who feel pretty safe and pretty secure and who kind of enjoy capitalism, and right, it's like, that's not the language that's going to resonate with us and get us moving or motivated.
Yeah. And, you know, a couple comments. One is, I don't know if there's any growth is possible without curiosity and just showing up from a place of, there are people with different experiences from me, and I should come from a place of curiosity. Because without that, everybody's just kind of defending their worldview, and there's that. But there is also a comment in here about this is about creating class struggle, and the more, you know, a key element of social change movements is, this is not about creating struggle, it is simply revealing that these divisions are there. And, you know, Gandhi started it, and it was definitely part of the civil rights movement. Peaceful protesters just trying to get you know, the right to vote, which is an American right, and they get beat on with clubs or attacked by dogs. And they're not creating a struggle, they are simply refusing to continue to pretend it doesn't exist. It's revealing differences and conflicts that are there. And I think it's important. I think that's, you know, there have been a lot of people saying the racism isn't worse today, it's just being filmed. Everybody's got cameras. And it's not that there's more of this, but we are seeing it. And I think that's a way to understand this. This is not about creating, you know, racial segregation and oppression. It's about understanding it's always been there, and how might we do our work to shift it a little bit so that our kids live in a world that's different.
Thank you. So, you know, along the lines of, you know, I know so many people, they loving America and feeling such gratitude and just intense feelings for America. You know, one person asks, I believe there are racists in America, but aren't we hurting the country by saying that racism is systemic?
Well, so a therapist will say, right, it's like, if there's a problem and you don't acknowledge it, and you don't face it, and you don't treat it, it's going to do you in. So really, if you love America, it's really important to talk about it and to change it, just the same way you would if somebody has high cholesterol or a drinking problem, right? That being nice isn't going to serve anybody, and it actually is going to cause harm, right? It's not just a benign thing, it actually causes harm. So to me, the critique and the criticism and the exposure is an act of love, because if you didn't care, you wouldn't bother.
Yeah. And, you know, one of my favorite ways of thinking about things, a guy named Michael Brown, who started City Year, the organization where I worked for 10 years, you know, he says America isn't perfect, but it's perfectible, because its values are perfect. You know, and America was founded in this real paradox, you know, there's that word again, of just unbelievably noble values that were revolutionary in their time, and remain revolutionary today, to truly believe that everyone is created equal. But America's reality, when those words were founded, were a brutal system of slavery. And one could read all of American history as an attempt to narrow the gap between our noble values and the like a reality which was very far from those values. And I think it's an act of, I am a patriot. I love this country. Everything I do is about, comes from love of country. And I believe that working to narrow the gap between the values that we espouse and the truth that we live every day is an act of love for this country. And I think the only way we can do that is, as Frank said, to be, to open ourselves to the darkness while also recognizing the light is as real as the darkness, and try to be with the wholeness and heal it in whatever ways we can.
And I don't know if you've had this experience, but it's one of those things where, like, I think of like families, right? You're the most angry. The people we love have the capacity to really make us the most upset because we love them. And so in a way, you could see all of a lot of the anger that's going on in America right now is one, I agree with what you're saying, like it's just being filmed more now. But it really is, it's a testament of love. And different people have different ideas about how to express that love and different love languages. But that foundation of, I'm only angry because I care.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I think there's a lot of evidence right now that we just haven't heard what people of color have been saying for a long time, for centuries. And I think there's a sense, as we're all kind of stuck home in the quarantine and just seeing the news, of we are listening. And the fact that we're here having this conversation is a manifestation of kind of our current moment, of we're like, we need to listen in a different way, because this stuff's been happening for a long time. And so, you know, this is part of the change that has to happen, is to just listen to what people have been saying. And, you know, it's always a struggle when one does this work to stay in touch with one's idealism and not give way to cynicism. But I have moments when it's fun to imagine of what if this was the moment America, instead of running from its, you know, history, turned and faced it directly and started to heal it. And what if one day there was a time when, you know, all these warring factions around the world could look to America and say, wow, if that country can find a way to come together and to work on this and to heal this and to shift these systems and to make things genuinely, you know, more equal and just, what kind of example would that be for the world? And, you know, we got a lot of work to do to get there, but I do think it's important to imagine what that could mean, not just for us, but for the whole world, where there are so many people causing each other so much pain.
Do you have thoughts about what those specific things that we might be able to, you know, specifically do? Like, one questioner notes that segregated living seems to be a basic defining factor in perpetuating the US problem. And so having, you know, we need to have schools with all strata of students coming in from the local geographic area, not bussed in. And our local community needs to have personal experiences with all kinds of kids from an early age. And the questioner notes, but money and fear rule. So how can we do it? So, you know, that being one approach. And then also, if there are other suggestions that you both see as far as how to, in this moment, you know, actionably move things in a positive way for the US.
Well, you know, one thing for me, again, so this is a therapist, my profession heavily influences, well, I became a therapist because of how I see things, but I think I'm working with a community of therapists who are wanting to take up an anti-racist perspective. And one of the things that they're really attentive to is how quickly white people want to run to solving the problem. We want to fix it. There's a sense, you know, part of a white racial identity is struggles with perfectionism and urgency. And I'm certainly familiar with those feelings. And I think the main thing right now, because this one's hard enough, is listen. When people of color describe their experiences, listen. So often we're not listening at all. So often we don't even get the chance to hear it. right? So one of the things would be seek out places where people of color have a voice. Read their books, watch their movies, have conversations, not burdening people by having them explain what it's like to be a person of color, but right, listening. And I think because if we listened, a lot of times we can use the same love and care we have for the people that we love and care about, right, can emerge, right? We start to go, yeah. And then part of it is getting to know people of color better. The other part is they have a lot of suggestions on what can help. They have a lot of suggestions because they've had a lot of experiences around well-intentioned programs that fell short for a variety of reasons. So for me, the best place to start, and really in terms of effort, it's a really low bar, right? To make the effort to listen.
So, I have my favorite public policy approach to this, which is national service. I worked 10 years for an AmeriCorps program. It is amazing to see, kids from wealthy suburbs serving alongside kids, from needy schools, serving, City Year was focused on addressing the high school dropout crisis. There's one of the biggest educational studies has kind of proven statistical significance. This intervention actually changes the academic trajectory of kids in high need schools. So, and the core members just emerge with this understanding of they've gotten out of their bubble. The privileged kids see the world beyond the boundaries of their town. And for the kids who are from those communities, they understand that they have a voice and power in new ways. Everybody is transformed. And if every single future lawyer, policeman, actor, clergy member, if this was just a rite of passage, I think that is how we weave together the kind of, fragmented fabric of our civic culture right now. So I think that's, and also, I've spent some time in Canada. Canada had pretty much treated Indigenous peoples the same way we did, but Canada has gone through a 5-year Truth and Reconciliation process where they turned and faced it. They had a whole government process to surface and focus on exactly what they did. And they have a lot more work to do, but it is amazing to hear the way they talk about the Indigenous people and the kind of shifts because they as a country chose to face it. And, you look at South Africa, you look at Rwanda, it's not like nobody's ever done these things at a national scale before. There is a pathway to healing these historic, massive, painful histories. And we just have to choose to do it.
I think it's beautiful to get the scope, right? Because exactly, and of course, Jewishly, that's our watchword, Shema, listen, hear, that's what we are charged to do. And then also to be thinking, towards what examples to look for globally. Folks have done this successfully, even despite the pain. And since there is, very much a Jewish space here and audience right now, one question that has come up a number of times from different people in the Jewish community are folks who want to be allies to Black people. They speak of pride, whether it's their part personally in being part of the civil rights movement or pride of the Jewish participation in and Rabbi Heschel. But then they're challenged because they see some Black social justice and or political movements that also carry anti-Israel or anti-Semitic messages. So, what are your thoughts on that, Max?
This work is very complex. But I will say this, if you understand the philosophy, the worldview of white supremacy, Black people and Jews are viewed as, enemies of the white race. And, Black people are kind of viewed as subhuman. And Jews have a really tricky spot because we're white, so we can pass. So we're able to kind of nefariously undermine the whole system. And it is very much in the interest of you know, white supremacists, that we are fighting each other rather than working together to address these systems, you know. And I will definitely honor it's complicated, but I also know, you know, one of the bigger problems was there, you know, in the 60s, there was this deep relationship between Blacks and Jews, and those relationships kind of frayed. And it was one of the things we learned was we just kind of weren't together at the table. And that is really changing. And I have to say, there's a whole community of Jews of color who are really at the table with Black Lives Matter, making sure that Jewish perspectives are included there. Those are hard conversations, you know, but I do think, you know, I personally have a thing, if you can agree with somebody on 70% of stuff, you should really, you should stay connected, you know. There's, so I will honor the complexity, but also realize there's a lot of stuff going on that's bigger than all of us. And there's power in staying connected while being able to have the difficult conversations with honesty with each other as we move together to address these systems that are really not good for any of us.
And that there are a variety of opportunities, right? This particular person or this particular group may not be a good fit for whatever reason, but seek out other groups, seek out other people, right? It's not a monolithic sort of attitude. So I always think of it as like, there's a place I can fit, I know it.
And, you know, I can't resist one of the ways that kind of these systems of race work is when a white person says something, it's only them speaking. And when a person of color says something, it's they're representatives of the entire group, and it's the responsibility of that entire group to get that person in line, you know. And it's an expectation we don't have of, you know, white people, that every white person should be trying to, you know, change the perspectives of the white racist people out there. So we have to kind of recognize there's a whole difference in the Black community. There's as much diversity of perspective as there is in the white community, and the fact that some people of color say those things doesn't mean every person of color believes it, and it's a problem for us to treat them all that way, and to you know, kind of engage with them as a monolithic group that they are not and we are not.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's 8:28. I'm trying to be very good about, you know, keeping close watch on our time. So I want to thank our audience, you know, such excellent questions. I'm sorry, there are a few that we did not get to. Oh, there was one book that was recommended that I wanted to bring up specifically in reference. I've been holding it to that other question, Jews and Blacks, a dialogue on race, religion, and culture in America. And it's Cornell West and Michael Lerner. So I haven't gotten to read that yet. So I'm excited to have that new one. So thank you for that. I
can't resist noting it's a great book. It's also about 25 years old, and things have shifted.
So that's also helpful to really, oh gosh. So there's a new one to, I wonder, or maybe if I just look that up on Amazon, it'll say people who purchased that, and I'll find the one from 2019. I hope. So. And you know, and sort of that being the question about relations between Black and Jewish people being something that is coming up regularly. I'm hoping that we can have a further discussion in the future. But you know, you both have spoken so powerfully about the importance of the work that we do on ourselves, and about really taking a hard look, an honest look at our own role and at our own work within whatever system. And I'm aware that, you know, coming up, we're going to be in the Jewish month of Elul, and that month it marks the time that Jews began preparing for High Holy Days. And that month is characterized by what's called a Cheshbon HaNefesh, this literally an accounting of the soul, like opening the ledger and going through as carefully as an accountant would to look at ourselves carefully and do that deep introspective work in ourselves and in all of our relationships. So in support of anti-racist work during Elul, what we're going to do is begin some reflective work that will culminate in a participatory and a facilitated workshop towards awakening to race within ourselves. And that's going to be during the Yamim Noraim, the days of awe. It's just lovely when the calendar supports exactly the work that you're, hoping to do. So that'll be around the 4th week of September. So, yeah, and also, even though, we are sort of setting this according to kind of the spiritual energy of the Jewish calendar, even if you're not Jewish, you are absolutely welcome. And you will find that this is not coming from a spiritual perspective as much as it is really just the anti-racist work that some folks want to really look at in themselves and continue doing. So thank you to VOS's Anti-Racist Task Force, which is currently Kiyomi Kowalski and Carla Adivi and Lori Eisenberg. Thank you for your hard work this evening and all the education that you've been bringing to our community and our communities. And thank you to Rabbi Julia Weiss of Congregation Orami for your insight. And thank you to both of you, Max and Frank. Thank you so much. We're just grateful you giving all this time and your expertise and your whole self to this evening. So thank you so much.
Honored to be a part of it. Appreciate that. I wish you all the best.
Thank you.